how many of you have noticed in the last year or the last 6 months that things are happening faster and faster? Special things like weird synchronous events, like, whoa, that's low probability, right? Is that happening to everyone? Something is going on. Something is going on. And we're trying to come up with an explanation for all this, which I call like the geek's model for God. So with that, I'm going to get us a little grounded. Josh mentioned that I go way back. And yes, I'm 57, which means I go way back. I remember Neil Armstrong setting foot on the moon in 1969. Is anybody here? A few? Yes?
I just watched the documentary.
That's good enough. I went out the week after, when they were on the moon, I went out to pick up the garbage cans at the street in our town, and I looked and looked and looked, trying to figure if I could see a little glint on the moon. And little did I know that Michael Collins, who was the lunar module commander or pilot, had a high-powered telescope looking down, trying to find them, and he had a great difficulty. I don't think he ever sighted them. Isn't that amazing? He was 60 miles up. So to ground us a little, I'm going to hand out this precious thing. We named it Precious when I was at Weta Workshop in New Zealand. This got named by the founder of Weta as basically the blowout material for Mount Doom that contains the ring, but that's a whole other story. But what this is the one of the oldest evidence for life on Earth. It's a stromatolite from Western Australia, and the little ridges that you'll be able to touch and move your fingertips around are stromatolites. They're microbial mat community that was the sole story of life on Earth for 3 billion years. And for most exoplanets, probably this is all they got to before the planet went out of habitability. So feel this for a moment, because this is from an alien world. This is a world where there's no oxygen in the atmosphere. There's like coffee-colored oceans and orange skies and asteroid impacts and massive braided river systems and volcanoes just going. So this is from about 3 billion years ago, so I just pass it around. And it kind of is grounding, because this is your common ancestor. This is what made us, because the microbial mat community built the world that we're in. It oxygenated the atmosphere, it dumped all that red iron out of the oceans and made the world ready for complex life. It took a lot of labor. So what we're going to do is take you on a journey. Oops. It's not working. You may have to pull out and put it back in again. I don't know. Is it in play mode? Oh, something just happened. Oh, yes. There we go. Oh, wonderful. So we're going to try to answer the question, what is going on? Which Terence McKenna used to love to ask. What is going on? You know, but the answer, sort of the furtherance of this question, I call this the field. This thing that is connecting all of us, that is doing all this synchronous magic for us, that we can make requester calls and stuff comes back. Does anyone do that? Make a requester call like, I need a car pass for Burning Man. Boom, it comes. It's a miracle. So the field is amazing. But what are its origins? How did it start up in humans? How did we learn how to snap pixels? You'll see about that. Consciousness. What the heck is it? And how do we cruise it, and how do we hack it? And something new, first seen here, this is Peoria, right? So you're going to get the first thing, the big download. It's an extra bonus icing. So bootstrapping life. Yeah, let's start from here just to save time. Okay, so you can see that all online. Oh, good, this is working. So 100 and some plus years ago, Charles Darwin wrote this incredible sentence about the origin of life. So he's the man who came up with the mechanism, or at least the primary publisher of the mechanism for how evolution works, natural selection, which is the thing that is generating all of this that we're in right now. And he thought that perhaps conceive of some warm little pond somewhere with all sorts of ammonia, phosphoric salts. He got that all right. Light, heat, electricity, not so much electricity, but it was the magic of the 19th century. Present that a protein, now this is the most important part of the sentence here. A protein compound was chemically formed, ready to undergo still more complex changes. Does anyone know what that is? Away from equilibrium systems, right? Anybody in complexity theory here? So you grow a little polymer and you get it longer and longer and longer and longer. That's hard to do. Mostly water breaks things down. So he actually nailed it, and our field ignored it for 125 years. So for 125 years there was chemical soups, these primordial soups. Then we had the great science experiment of all science horror films, the spark chamber of Miller and Urey, right? That showed that you could make amino acids by sparking an atmosphere. And that launched our field in 1953, about the time of the announcement of the structure of DNA. It was a cool time in the early 50s. 1977, these things were discovered, these hydrothermal vents in the bottom of the ocean. And it was suggested that perhaps this is where life could start. And that's the rabbit hole that the field went down for 30 years. The chemists never liked it because, if you're going to form something, it's going to break down in the ocean. How do you create evolution in a dissipative, fairly violent environment like this? So Dave Deemer at UC Santa Cruz and I went back to the drawing table, and Dave had discovered, I'll show you an experimental thing about 10 years ago, but about the time that we came up with our model, our colleagues had discovered this in Australia, stromatolites in 3.5 billion year old rock, in banded rock that is basically geyserite, laid down by geyser splashing at the surface. This is extremely rare, and this was the earliest evidence of metabolism and living ecosystems on the Earth. So they discovered that at the same time as we were doing our work. They were digging up, I dug this up. This is the stromatolite that's similar to the one that you're passing around. And you can touch. So the rock record for life was emerging in this time. Here's a lakeshore stromatolite. And here's stromatolite at the seashore living today in Shark Bay in Australia. Just amazing. So this is the rock record of the earliest evidence for life on Earth. But at the same time, we were conceiving of Darwin's warm little pool as a hot little splattering spring in the Hadean, say 4 billion years ago, that would have looked like this. Would have looked like the ancient Earth. And that on the sides of the rock here, where wet-dry cycling was occurring at that boundary, and that was our intuition that Darwin didn't have, which is wet-dry cycling can give you the chemical magic. So here's our setting sort of sliced in two, and here's a landscape that can collect material falling from space, and subject to all these pools, all these temperatures, so different temperatures, different cycling when geysers fill pools and they dry down. It creates an engine that through time can create forms, cycle them, and adapt them, subject them to a type of evolution. So Dave had discovered about 15 years ago that if you hydrate and dehydrate little dishes of water that contain the monomers of RNA, which is an important polymer of life, you can form long, long chains. Every time you do that, you form a longer chain, every time you dry down and re-wet. So he built this machine in the lab that rotates vials around. And in one vial, it dehydrates, and in one station, it rehydrates with an acidic solution. And what we got was the compression of these building blocks of RNA between layers of lipid. So you introduce basically lipid, which is like the cell walls of your body. And they squeeze all this stuff down into these two-dimensional sheets, and you get the formation of polymers. And this is some of our product after 4-hour cycles. And this goes through a technology that our lab invented called nanopore sequencing. And we can see the blockade, so we know we're actually making RNA. And now other groups have done peptides, and we've recently started to self-assemble DNA in the lab from scratch, from the bases. So we can self-assemble chains of DNA, and that's going to become a new medical technology to interrupt the action of all viruses. So we spun a company out from UC Santa Cruz to do that. So I basically said to Dave at one point, the geologists do not believe us. They do not believe we can form our little membranous vesicles and polymerize in their environment. They criticize us and say, you'll never get anything to happen in pools like this. So I went out to Yellowstone with the field season, and we did it. So here's a regular erupting geyser in the Buffalo Meadows. That's what the environment, the outflow looks like. So there's no life in here, but this is full of this sort of chemosynthetic life every time the geyser goes off. And I placed acidic and alkaline waters together with our lipids, and I could shake it up and I could see the trillions of little compartments forming. So it worked. And then the next year we decided we're going to try to do this in a live hot spring, to do the whole chemistry in the hot spring. And I'm going to show you this wonderful video from last June of last year in Rotorua, where we did it. We were able to do it. And we not only were forming the polymers, but we were encapsulating the polymers in vesicles, and you'll see why that matters later.
It's just a case of weird science. Leading American scientist Dr. Bruce Damer is at Rotorua's Hell's Gate, conducting research trials aiming to answer the age-old question, how did we get here?
It's very exciting. It's a 21st century science, revolutionary science to watch. If we can find this cycle as the engine of creation effectively. Also that we came not from an individual, not from competing individuals, but from a network, a collaborative community was at the taproot of the tree of life.
Dr. Damer's research could turn previous origins of life science on its head. His testing with the hot springs on land may have been the starting point for life itself. Dr. Damer's searching for RNA, a nucleic acid, and the basis of all living cells.
So what we think is that RNA could have been the first polymer that life synthesized first at random in a process like this, and then picked through selection, through these cycling protocells, which we're doing here in the hot spring, picked ones that worked.
For years, scientists had accepted the theory that life began in hydrothermal events in the ocean. Charles Darwin once speculated that biological molecules might form in a warm little pond, and Dr. Damer believes this to be much closer to the truth.
If we can show to our colleagues and to the world that we can self-assemble an important biopolymer of life called RNA in a hot spring pool that's cycling, in the conditions that would have been around in the early Earth on these big volcanic islands, our colleagues are really going to seriously look at doing more experiments. And it'll create a whole movement, a whole sort of paradigm shift in origin of life thinking, back to Darwin's warm little pond, only now it's a cycling hot little pool.
Jake McLeod, Local Focus.
So what do you do when you get RNA to form long chains on its own, which is an amazing result on itself? You get the following. So here is about a 500 mer linked piece of RNA from that hot spring experiment. And this is long enough that it can fold and have what's called catalytic activity. This is an image from an atomic force microscope, and we've never been able to see our product until now. You can see all the little curlicues and hairpins in the RNA. We're now doing the same thing, self-assembling DNA. So this changes the entire origin of life picture now, that actually life is a self-assembly process, which is a whole new idea, that it can self-assemble in the environment. So when you self-assemble these polymers, and you can get them inside these protocellular compartments just simply by wet-dry cycling, you set up a roulette wheel. You set up a random chance trying system. And let's show you how this works. Remember I explained that this was going to be a God for geeks? So here's a geeky way of saying, we can write programs by random chance. We don't need a programmer in a system like this to write programs. So it's no need for a creator to create code. And so what you would do is, if you wanted to write programs by chance, and you guys could go home and actually build this system, you take a random paper tape punch system, punch out a whole ton of program tapes, random program tapes, load them into a computer like this, which I have in my collection, the Altair 8800 from 1975, which just has lights on the front. And the program, it's run by energy and it cycles. And it has something called a processor, which runs these programs. And most of them crash. They just crash the system. But some of them light up diodes on the front of the computer, so they're picked. And program A, here it says it runs. So it's a simple selection process, just ligates or attaches a new random program B, C, and D onto A and just runs it again. Does it light up 2 lights? Maybe. It just keeps going and going. The simple selection criteria, do you light up a light? Yes, then I'll attach you to a new random program, and the program grows and grows and grows and grows. And eventually it evolves. From an Altair, we get an IBM PC, and maybe really super long programs generate the hardware of a laptop and a smartphone. And this takes a long time. So we pay slightly efficient more entities to do this called engineers. So it's the evolution of software and hardware together. So if one was to say, where do you find this in nature? It is in the organics falling in from space, and we saw them in the Perseid meteor shower just now, that get polymerized between these lipid layers that also fall in from space. The programs, the paper tapes, are polymers. They load into the computer called a little warm cycling pool. There's our Charlie Darwin. There's our energy source. It's wet-dry cycling. And they form programs called protocells, which run in the processor, and they either crash or they don't. They either pop or they do not. That's the criteria for the evolution of software and hardware together in the living world. And what you just did tonight by coming in and having some fruit and driving carefully and whatnot is to keep your container together so you live another day. So we're still doing this thing. Try to keep from popping. So when you have this system set up, you have this roulette wheel. So we have dry films that bud off these random compartments, what we call protocells, that get down into, the surviving ones get into a sludge at the bottom of the dish. We can see them. They form a network effect. It's called the progenote. And they cycle again and again. And we see this in the lab. There's freeze fracture of the dried stuff. Here's budding off protocells. Here's testing of stability. Here's the returning line of little stable protocells. And this is a kind of primitive life cycle. It's a kinetic trap. If you're a chemist, it's called a kinetic trap. So how does this all go together? We call this the hot spring origin of life. And if you're on your wonderful Hadean landscape with your material coming in from space, you have plenty of organics that are falling into these pools that are mixing. So you get all kinds of chemistry that starts in those pools. It accumulates and it concentrates. The chemistry does all kinds of magic. It gets you into a cycling pool that's filling on a regular basis, sets up your engine. Then material is flowing out of the pool and dying because it doesn't have the right chemistry or the right cycle, so it starts to adapt. Guess what it does? It learns how to lick sunlight. It learns how to feed from the sun, so it can make its own building blocks. Ends up in lakes, which is where we see that stromatolite you're passing around. That's from a lake shore. That's lakeshore life. And then it ends up adapting to the marine environment, salty environment. There's the stromatolites at the marine shore. And this is all backed up by the rock record. So it's a beautiful co-tangential thing in co-discovery in science that this has all come together in the last 3 years. And it's really the roots of the tree of life where we think we've found. We found how the roots themselves formed. And it was featured on Scientific American's cover a couple of years ago. And now it's being tested worldwide by team after team after team. It's a phenomenon now. So that, we think, is how life could have started on the earth. It's a cycling system with selection. It's self-assembly. But the key thing for you guys, the God for the Geeks, is a network. You had to have that sludge of protocells to form the network to beat the second law, to beat entropy at its own game. And we'll look at more a bit of that later. So roll the clock forward to just about 90 million years ago. What about us? What about the origins of us? Why is it that we can see pixels and other animals can't? That's a big clue. Ask yourself that question. Here's a skeleton of a prosimian. It was found, this is a more recent one, but this one they found a femur bone that was 55 million years old. The prosimian is the common ancestor of all apes, tarsus, everything, monkeys, and actually lived before the Chicxulub impact. This is what we all looked like. This is our common ancestor. These little guys, they were hunting insects for protein. That was their main protein. They were chewing down leaves and they craved berries and sap. And so it was basically a burger, fries, and a shake diet. So the next time you just can't resist, passing the in and out, it's because of your insectivore nature. So where did they live? They lived up in the rainforest canopy in these huge, giant trees. And they lived like this. They lived in a kind of a, come on, say it, they lived in balls, in communal balls. And for safety and warmth and things like this. So picture this. It's dawn in the Amazon or / African belt forest. And what happens is this little guy here, or little gal, I call her Overdrive. She's the explorer of the prosimian world. She has planned this all out because their brains are tiny but devious, right? They're our ancestors. So she's waiting for the dawn because why? Because when that light hits the rainforest canopy, she will see the nightly tree production of sap, which is like pure sugar, pretty much. So she peels herself away from the ball, not waking them up, and starts her move out to the limb because she sees the globule of tree sap just lit up. And she gets to the globule of tree sap and she starts sucking it down. Now it does two things for her. It gets her high. So she's like, whoa, she's noticing the stars and like, what is going on? She's sort of waking up. And one eye is looking back at the ball because if she gets seen, it's community property, she'll get busted. Her ass will get busted. And big time because she's taking the sacred elixirs. And she is, with her trippy brain, she's now looking forward and she sees a pattern of squares in the dawn across the tree limb. Like, oh, what's that? Oh, that's cool. Oh, what was that? It just moved. It just moved. What is that? Well, it's this. So waiting for her a trillion times, a trillion trips to the elixir, a quest for the mind to open and get high. Does it sound familiar? There is this waiting, lurking in the wings, or literally the head is of the number one predator for us for 60 million years with tree snakes. And it's waiting, and she either jumps, because she recognizes the pattern of the scales, or she snaps down. She snaps two, she snaps down. Snaps two, snaps down. Snaps two, runs back, makes a copy of herself. This is where we got our vision. So we were always a little psychedelic. But basically, the human brain grew, but at the core of the human brain was a pixel processor because of this snake thing that went for 60 million years. We were really good at seeing these patterns, but it was at the core of our consciousness. So by the time you get to Ardipithecus and you get to some of these guys, they're all tripping out on patterns all the time. And so what are the patterns? The patterns started this way as tree snake scales, which evolved with us as we started to figure them out. They got more colorful, they got more mesmerizing. But we turned it into this. We turned it into culture. We turned it into everything we've done. The patterns on these chairs, carpets, books, illustrations, TV, media. We turned it into the modern world. So we built this. This is what our consciousness has wrought from, in a sense, being trained by the serpent. So these amazing megacities that are all just basically a freaking ton of pixels or voxels. So this is the world we came from, this beautiful world. But in the meantime, we're kind of making an ugly world. We're replacing the old, gooey world of agriculture with the pixelated world. I call this emerald and the azure civilization. The azure is replacing the emerald, pretty much. Now, what is going on? So again, Terence, what is going on? Well, we've learned a lot in the last 40 or 50 years about how people booted up. So now perhaps we understand how our pixel consciousness booted up. But what about our internals? Because every species comes through traumatic stress in order to evolve, and we sure did. 60 million years of fighting with tree serpents was very traumatic. So when you come across a snake on the path, as we did the other day, Aaron just jumped. It's hardwired, right? So it's it's trauma, but it's valuable. Because if you get bitten, you're not going to reproduce. But what is going on with all that trauma? It's kind of like a little kid inside of all of us. When you get really super activated? I call this the inner kindergarten, and every one of us has them. But what does it do in society? This screaming inner kindergarten. And where is it from? How's it representing? So here's a beautiful example of this on the playa about 3 years ago. Look at that couple that is just not having a good day, but look what's inside reaching out. Just a beautiful image. The little children, they're there. So what is going on with us? At the same time as we're in inner kindergarten and we're confused and we're enlightened sometimes, and sometimes we're really not, and other things happen, this has come into our lives. And we're looking at one right now. We're mesmerized by this thing. Huh? What happens when you're on your phone and you're doing this, and first you wake up in the morning and you're doing this? Dopamine? What else? You hold your breath. Studies show that people hold their breaths when they're looking at the screen. Just like overdrive, sitting there, sucking down her morning coffee, watching the TV of the snake scales, getting all tripped out, and she becomes a prey. So in a sense, this serpent is here, it's back, we made it. It's called technology. It's coiled around us tightly. It's coiling ever tightly around us, our whole civilization. So coming through that serpent is, very serpent-like, is all this stuff, right? Like anxiety-inducing, crazy-making. It's this coiling in of, things aren't good in the world, even though if you look outside, everything's good and your latte's been made and everything. But so what is going on? It's sort of self-predation. Part of ourself is predating on another part. And that part is probably a wounded part from our trauma. So if we talk and resource that wounded part and that trauma, we'll release the serpent's coil. Now the serpent is evolving us, but it could strangle us too. It could completely eliminate us if we don't deal with this thing. Totally, right? Everyone feels it. We could totally self-strangle in some way. So here's a great metaphor from 1983. Do you remember this scene? From Northern California. This is Luke Skywalker, who has defeated Darth. And Darth is his father. You know about that, right? The great mythology that Luke is... Huh? No. I'm from Canada. I know nothing. So what does Darth say? James Earl Jones, great voice. Luke, take off this mask. No, take off my mask. So he takes off the mask. What does he see? This wounded being that represented the empire. This amazingly soft-eyed being. So this in the 1980s was a representation of that the fundamental thing that we need to do is look at this wounded child throughout our society. Huge lesson right from here, right from Northern California. Pretty powerful stuff. So this is some of Mikey Siegel's work in consciousness hacking at Esalen about 1.5 years ago. And this is an amazing thing. This is kind of like the heart sync connected to auditory, connected to this visual stimulation. So you could see other people's heartbeats. And then it was time to music. And wherever heart sync has been tried out, it has created this complete union between people. Even if it's just two people in a little pod at Burning Man, people don't want to get out of it. They get out and they're like, whoa, it's amazing. So why I'm showing you this is that this is the serpent, this is tech, this is pixels, but we're using it for something else. We're using it to open consciousness, create empathy. So we can use the serpent for that too. It's the greatest tool we've ever made. It's just amazing. So it really is about healing this inner kindergarten. That is actually our great technology, our great challenge of this century. And we're learning how to do it. I'm in a program with some of the people here called Luminous Awareness, and that's the tech that we work on, is healing our inner kindergartens. And it produces huge transformative change. You can work with the medicines, you can work with Vipassana, you can work with 100 practices, but humanity has the greatest tools we've ever had to do this job in this century. So what does this all prepare us for? This understanding of where we might have come as a living world, and then how we boot up. How did we boot up as a species? Well, I think you ready for real geeky stuff? It prepares us for us geeks to meet our God. The geek God. Consciousness, cruising and hacking the geek God. So for me, the geek God was, geez Louise, what was the magic, secret, fantastic thing, the alchemical thing that carried physics into biology? That amazing process, right? You think about it. You got this cosmos that gets a D for creativity, right? 10 billion years you go back, and when we look through James Webb, we're going to see like, oh my God, it's the same galaxies and the same dust and the same everything for billions of years, not much productivity in the cosmos. It gets a D. But suddenly when you get life, you get huge uptake in complexity. So what happened there? Well, one night I did my usual dream, my usual, what I call an endostate dream. And I asked it, I said, well, how were we made? And it said, are you sitting down? And I said, I'm lying down. And I was shown this undulating plane of physics, and it said, push on one side. So I pushed on one side, and it undulated pre-statably, classical physics. And then I noticed that there was this little blob in the depths of physics. It was my favorite thing in the world, a protocell. A membranous compartment that can capture things and not let them go, and make them interact. I said, oh cool, a protocell. And suddenly two protocells appeared next to each other, and there was stuff going across this sort of dip between them. Like there's a lot more traffic than I thought there would be. Well, what's going on? Oh, and then a whole bunch of them appeared in a sludge. But there was all this transmission across their membranes, and it sort of looked like a little simple network. And then the dream, which was a very geeky dream, said, okay, here's 3 Cartesian plots. Okay, what's this one? It had a P on it. I said, I don't know what that is. And it says, oh, come on. And I said, well, P for probability? It said, bingo. Probability. That any time you crowd things together in an enclosure, you increase the probability of things happening. Okay. And then it said, what's the second curve? I don't know, some kind of interconnection or something? I said, yes, look, stuff is flowing through here, get a clue. Like, it's a network effect. It can happen just on its own, spontaneously. Physics can't do this. Physics is doing this, but it's new. It's a new thing in the universe. And then it said to me, well, what's the third curve? What is it? Come on. I said, I don't know, some kind of memory or something? I said, bingo. On this structure can arise the first memory, a genetic polymer, which we're now seeing in the lab, which is really cool. Memory can emerge on a system of probability shaping and interconnection. It can emerge on its own, a memory templating system. So where does this all go? Well, it kind of then got abstracted, like, okay, he said, buddy, there are 3 things here. Probability shaping, like rolling of a dice, interaction networks, which grow, and a memory system, which gets bigger and bigger. More memories get written in red and written in red. And it said to me, this is it. This is all you need to create all the complexity that you think that you understand. So probability shaping, protocells, interconnection, mass of protocells, memory, genes moving around horizontally in the protocellular mass. What's happening in this room, you've all come to this meeting, you're crowded together in an enclosure. We're doing this interaction, symbolic messages are passing around, and you're remembering stuff that's being recorded to be shared. That's cultural evolution. PIM, the same process. So it's like, oh, that's pretty cool. It's like a TOE, you know, theory of everything type thing. So is this a blueprint for sort of an engine of creation, a general formalism? Or you could even say, is it kind of like the Copernican revolution, where Copernicus said, I think that things rotate around the sun, not around the earth. And he published this after his death, so he didn't lose his head or his funding. Well, Galileo got in trouble, but he published this map of, well, it's the heliocentric universe. This is called the Copernican revolution. It was a major deal for hundreds of years. It showed that we weren't the center of everything. There were other worlds. And then when Galileo saw the moons of Jupiter, he realized, wow, there's a whole other solar system there. So could it be that this PIM little formalism we've discovered in our chemistry is actually at the center of any generative and emergent system? So perhaps it can touch physics because it could give physics a way to read and write information, which they've never had. It's actually kind of a revolution in chemistry and in geology for the origin of life. It is actually teaching us where to look for life in the universe. We need cycling systems with compartmentalization. It's going now into evolutionary biology, into something called niche construction theory with our work with groups in the UK. Is this actually the basis for the generation even of experience itself? And perhaps a way to roll complexity theory and AI into a new generation? Because currently AI and machine learning don't use genes and they don't use evolution, right? Could this be the basis for future AI? I think so. So take a look at this through time. Physics of the cosmos. Remember I said the cosmos gets a D? Because all it is doing has been doing this on-off thing, state changing for billions of years. Stars form, they blow up. Stuff encounters, it's state changing, but it doesn't have linear information. It doesn't remember things. So, but when you introduce biology for the first time, you have this PIM system, things are remembered. They're called genes, and it allows you to build better cells in the future. So you have a third state. Then suddenly, neurons come. Now we're getting closer to consciousness here. Neurons are an ability to pass information and have memory and change the response of an organism while it's alive, not just between generations. Then if you pack enough neurons together, it might create something called consciousness. Just get a lot of them together. Now that's where you guys all come in, how many, you know. But what we're proposing here is that this PIM formalism underlies all observable phenomena and all felt experience. It's just continuously generating them. And I'll show you where a clue about this, that human consciousness can only sample a small subset of this, that this generative system, which is running at all levels, at all scale, from the entire planet down to individual protocells, down to metabolic cycles, is creating a field, a collective field. So here's the overview again: physics, 2-state, 3-state, biology, 4-state, learning, 5-state, consciousness, and then where do we go? Well, perhaps that it's when conscious beings, we could argue that we are conscious or not, but we support awareness looking back on the totality of our origins and evolution, like we're doing in this room tonight. We come into a state of wow, or what Buddha said was like, oh, the nerd nirvana. So perhaps in seeing all this and grokking all this, you come into the state of what would be in the old days called unity consciousness. But it's just a knowing how rare we are, but knowing where we started from and the process that made us. It's so large, it's so stupendously complex that you go into this state of So here's a model, because of course us nerds and hackers need ways to test things. So I would suggest to you that the synchronous field that I talked about in the beginning is a server available for structured queries. And the server is made out of us as nodes, but it also has the living world. It also has this, maybe the Jewish scholars call it the Akashic record. It has everything in it. It's like loaded to bear. You know, it's got all kinds of apps and services and whatnot. So if this is the field here, This is what I've done all my life, is that since protocells shaped the probability for their survival by crowding and by evolution, our conscious minds act within the collective field to use intention and attention in a way that protocells could not do. So for example, when I was a little kid, about 13 or 14, I thought, the origin of life, that's what I want to work on. And I put a really strong intention out there, and I said, that's the coolest thing. Within 5 minutes of putting that out, I had my first thought experiment, a bundle of molecules in front of my third eye, which I didn't know what a third eye was. And like, oh, hello, you must be a thought experiment. I read about that Albert Einstein had these when he was 16. He was riding alongside a beam of light. Like, this is a thought experiment. It's a delivered thing. It just comes out of somewhere, and you can talk to it. So I talked to it, and I said, I was about to ask it, how did those stick and ball things that are moving around in you kind of self-organize to create a living thing? And it turned to me and it asked me a question. It said, figure out how I made a copy of myself. And then I thought, that doesn't make any sense, because you're a machine, and to make copies of machines, you need big machines. You need a factory to copy cars. So that's nothing, that's not a question. And it winked and said, work on it. And 38 years later, I saw it. In another one of these delivered thought experiment visions, little machines in a network can make big machines and make complex machines. Oh, wow, the communal start of life, the network that made the living world, just as the internet is making our world. And so that was an intention set in 1976. And I literally, as each thing came in, like I was watched for these what I call marbles, rolling down into my desire of working on this problem. I would one day get a thing like, oh, if you go to this conference, you'll have some clue. So I go to the conference, I pick up the information, I meet somebody. And then another marble comes, do this, write this program. Okay, I did this, write this program. And then another marble comes, do that, do that, do that. And this is 1976, and this is 2006 and 2008, I meet Dave. It's like, whoa. So the valleys of probability, as long as I picked up the marbles of action from my intention, I would carve a way through this improbable landscape to, in 2017, publish what may go down as one of the greatest theories of the century, greatest hypotheses. It's testing amazing stuff, right? And I always believe that I could shape that field just by intention and paying attention. And you could try this too. So you can just travel through this probabilistic field to amazing outcomes. And you can sort of track it. You can test the hypothesis. You can set an intention and see what shows up on the street or in your life. It's amazing, like that Burning Man car ticket just came, that kind of thing happens. So kind of wrapping up this section, what I wanted to suggest to you is this, which is the Earth rotating into the sun every morning with all this incident solar radiation coming in, is the master cycler. This is what's powering all this. It's powering all the subcycles of all the metabolism of all the living things, and it's driving it very predictably, and it has driven us a long way. There's a way to test this. Take the Earth out of solar orbit and see how fast it really crashes. Amazing. So I promised you the icing on the cake. This is a new vision that came into my visioning thing, my little monkey pixelated. One night I drank way too much tree sap, and this is what came in. So this is the too much tree sap night. Don't tell anybody. It was the big download, the totality. So I was sitting at Moss Beach, looking out over a sunset, like we've been having beautiful sunsets, and I was filled with emotion in my heart, beseeching, doing the server call to the cosmos and saying, do you have any idea how rare we are? Now that we've seen 1,600 exoplanets, now that we've landed rovers on Mars, and it's like really a harsh place that died quite quickly, went out of habitability, Venus did too. Now that we have a model for how life might start, but it's still a breathtaking big distance between protocells and dividing living cells, that's where my thought experiments are these days. I'm trying to work out backwards from the first dividing cell in a network, in a progenote, How did it get all the tools lined up at the right moments to do cell division and pass genes on? This is hard stuff, right? I'm running thought experiment after thought experiment, trying to find the path. It's dense and complex, and like, I'm running probabilities, and it's still extremely low that we got to living cells from protocells. It's really not high. And you had to have just the right selection barrier, just the right time for those protocells to learn how to do pores, metabolism, catalysis, how to store information, how to express information. And it's all messy chemistry that's super sloppy. The code is pretty awful. And every time we try to do this in the lab, it crashes. How did life lift itself into the living form through the progenome? It's like, it's blisteringly unlikely. So one night, I asked the cosmos, I said, hey, can you just please pay attention to how rare we are? I know it's your job, according to Guth, to take everything back to the cosmic background, to the rest state, because you're fed up with all this complexity. That's why the universe is expanding faster and faster. It's dissolving, right? It's evaporating. But this thing happened. We happened along the way, you know, on the way to the dissolution of the cosmos back to the background, complex life emerged. Will you like pay attention to us? You know, it's geek talk to God. So then I looked out over the sunset, and this is what emerged. Whoa, what the heck is this thing? It's like an upside down bicycle. And I looked closer, and I looked down here. Whoa, okay, this is the cosmogenesis. This is all moving. So Ryan and I just finished this last night in 3D Studio. It's like pretty raw. This is the cosmogenesis, which made all the heavy atoms and molecules that became geology. And in the geological landscape, we have our springs that are the engine to create life. And we have all of these roots of the tree of life to distribute it amongst different pools, then lift it through this kind of smush zone into the microbial world. And as soon as the microbial world is capturing sunlight, this is all in one big living sculpture. So this is cool, wow. I'm gonna learn something from this, however it is. And then the sculpture has got a big fat base, and it starts to grow and grow and grow. And this is about 3.5 billion years ago, and there's a little staircasing. This is probably the ribosome, and this is probably the division between archaea and bacteria here, or something. It was like a single representation. And then I realized, where is it going? It's going all the way up here. What is going on? You know, there's Terence again. What is going on? What is this thing? And I sort of started to ask it the questions. And then it showed this spiraling thing. I realized that the spirals, every time the sun rose or the earth turned into the solar radiation, it was stacking the system. Slice after slice after slice, PIM, 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 more complex cells, stacking, stacking, stacking. The sole thing that was lifting all of life from the background of the cosmos itself was this cycling energy system with all the feedstocks. And it was this, going, and relentlessly. And occasionally there would be a strangulation event. There would be a big asteroid impact, or things would shatter, smash into the system. The Earth would freeze over, for example. That happened 2 or 3 times. Huge challenges, but then the system reset and kept climbing. And I said, well, what is going on? Well, it's this. This is growing a probability gradient or tower. So as we get up here, we're at an incredible probability potential energy from here. So here, when Earth had just formed, you could get all this kind of chemistry to go on. That's not too hard. This is hard all the way up here. So I thought, well, it's like Newton rolling a ball down a ramp and figuring out that it stores potential energy. We are storing the potential energy of improbability off the background. We represent that potential energy. And then the next thought came was, here's your simple little genetic polymers getting up into chromosomes, and they become information in culture. They become knowledge. They become ticker tapes of all kinds of things. And so this Akashic field, or this field, is filling with information, getting denser and denser. And then the interconnections are being built. So the interconnections between cells, between metabolic circuits in cells, and then all the way out to animal bodies and to ecosystem connections, and then to human culture, which is massively interconnected. You know, your spleen is connected to your thigh bone and your hip bone, and I mean, our bodies are this gigantic network of information flow, and then so is our culture. So I realized that if we're up here, we've been stacked, and we're in the dense interconnected network, where it's as densely infused with information, none of which is lost, even lineage, even past information. And it's all at this shimmeringly high level of improbability. Perhaps this is the field. This is what we feel. This is what made it the geek's explanation for God. So where are we now? Well, perhaps we're up here where simple organisms are just little dots here. You can't even see them. They start to generate bigger blobs, and that's complex organisms, multicellular, bigger bodies and bigger bodies and bigger bodies. And you know, there could be sedations in here, and there's prosimians in here, gradually learning how to have imagination and use vision. And what is this? I think that this perhaps is where we open to awareness. You know, could it be the Buddha's awe? Could it be that we awoke in some preliminary way and we looked out into our universe, and we looked out and we asked the question of, what is going on? All right, so perhaps this has happened, or this is still happening. We're not just, you know, paying our mortgages. We're not just looking for the next pizza. We're doing this. Now, what's in the future? So we always want to know. We're geeks. We want to know what the next app we should build, or whether self-driving cars will be even necessary. So what is in the future? I think it's something like this. I think that we're coming into a century, or maybe 2 or 3 centuries, where the cycling is so intense, and the devastation and the strangling functions on our world because of climate change and because of methane release in the 40s leading to the 2070s, where the weather is unbelievably violent, right? And we're getting ready to bridge over that. We're getting ready to build infrastructure to bridge the civilization over that. But it's a forcing function for evolution. So as things get intense, evolution picks up. If it doesn't strangle you, it doesn't kill you, it just drives you forward, drives us through that body healing, drives us to intelligence, drives us to work together, drives us to face against the strangling, predating serpent of our own nature and say, no, we can't afford that because it'll kill us. We can't afford to predate on each other anymore. End of story, end of fake news, end of all that. Because we just can't afford it, because we have to build bridges and we have to build seawalls and we have to do climate change mitigation everywhere. So we're up in here, and this thing is so intense. It's so intense, and then suddenly it all merges. All of that forcing function causes a single merge where everyone wakes up into a state. And that probably would be the state where we realize we made it through the worst of the violent climate changes to come. It could be the year 2100, 2200, whatever. The surviving humans, the surviving progenote, way out there, made it and is going to a new landscape. It now can populate the cosmos. And why we made it, while we made it, we finally knew fully who we were. We knew where we started. We knew what made us, basically what God was, and in all its magnificent complexity. And we knew how to work with this, the field itself. We could say, hey, we've got 1 billion tons of methane heading into our atmosphere, which is going to generate 4 to 8 hurricanes. Help us out. Okay, we wait for the server call. We're not alone. It helps us to build the infrastructure. It says, okay, the field is intelligent. It's going to help us get through this thing. Not just going to come from our noggins, right? We don't have enough. But the field is getting smarter, and it's waking up just as we're waking up. You know, when you take a medicine, when you take a psychedelic, or when you do a vipassana, or when you do meditation and amazing things happening, I think that's the field waking up in you that you are waking it up to. And we can use it as our amanuensis, as our friend and our guide to help us go forward. Because as I asked the cosmos that night, pay attention. We're rare. We're amazing. We need help. help here. So I think I'll leave you with that, but this is what came out in the last couple of weeks, that you're sharing this with you for the first. So I want to thank you for your attention.